listening to the Ag Policy Connection, brought to you by Real Agriculture in partnership with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. We're connecting the dots between the people and the policies that shape agriculture and farming today and into the future.
Welcome to another episode here of the Ag Policy Connection podcast, again brought to you by the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute and Real Agriculture. I'm your host, Kelvin Hepner, coming to you from our farm here in southern Manitoba. And on this season of the Ag Policy Connection, we've had a theme of focusing on the future of Canadian agriculture through the lens of sustainability. We've talked about sustainability in the context of what trade might look like in the future, livestock production in North America down the road, land use decisions, the importance and role of extension, and the impact of politics, as we heard from a panel of members of parliament sharing their perspectives on the impact of political decisions on environmental rules and policies at the farm level. But like all policies, it's a whole lot of talk and not much action unless they're actually implemented. And in agriculture, that means they have to be put into practice by farmers and ranchers in fields and pastures, in barns and greenhouses across the country. And so as part of this special episode of the Ag Policy Connection, we're going to explore the big question of what actually drives farmers to implement better sustainability or environmental practices at the farm level. We know from research that was done by CAPI and RealAgristudies just last year that found that 27% of farmers across Canada at the time said they were enrolled in either private or government programs aimed at encouraging the adoption of sustainable farming practices. But interestingly, only 14% of those farms said that the incentives were an absolute must or a requirement for them implementing or adopting that practice. So we've assembled a panel of 3 farmers from, I think we could say, diverse backgrounds and geographies to discuss that question of what drives farmers to implement sustainability practices. We're going to, of course, as part of that, discuss the role of market signals coming from customers and other players in the market for what we produce on farms. The role of government is a big part of this discussion as well, of course. Ultimately, also the importance of having farmers' voices actually heard in these conversations that are taking place in the market. That's part of what we want to accomplish with this episode as well. So we're going to ask our panelists to tell us a bit about their operations here shortly, but just a quick intro. We have Fred Lozman, who is a director with Alberta Beef. Fred runs a cow-calf and grain operation in the Claresholm, Alberta area, and is also quite involved on numerous boards, especially in the research side of things, as I'm sure he will share here shortly. We also have Ian McCreary, who owns and operates McCreary Land and Livestock Limited in central Saskatchewan with his wife and 2 sons. Ian was a former task force chair for Farmers for Climate Solutions. And our third panelist joining us for this episode will be very familiar to the Real Agriculture audience, but I think she also brings some very relevant perspective to this topic wearing her farmer hat today. That is Lindsay Smith, also of Shady Creek Lamb Company, based just outside of Ottawa, Ontario. So with that, let's get started. Our farmer panel here on the Ag Policy Connection, focusing on what drives adoption of practices that fall under that category of improved sustainability at the farm level. Ian, Fred, Lindsay, thank you for joining us here on the Ag Policy Connection. Why don't we start with a bit of a around the horn? And Fred, I guess let's go west to east. Fred, we'll start with you in Alberta, a bit about your farm background and where you're coming to this discussion from in terms of your context.
Yeah, thanks, Kelvin. Great to be here. And yeah, I helped to operate a farm in southwestern Alberta, so south of Calgary, along the eastern slopes of the Rockies. So we operate under a couple of corporate names and under really varied landscapes, some irrigation, and one of our cow herds runs with our friends on his ranch, and so native rangeland, so a really varied landscape. Yeah, we raise beef cattle and grains, oil seeds, some pulses. I'm busy off farm too with some obligations for as a director for Alberta Beef Producers, as a council member on their producer council for Beef Cattle Research Council, as a director for results driven ag research, so RDAR in the province here of Alberta here, and just helping to get a new enterprise off the ground, Western Crop Innovations, which is a crop breeding facility in Lacombe, Alberta. So I'm an interim director for them. So busy on farm and off farm.
Yeah, and saying yes to joining podcast discussions as well. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you again for that, Fred. Ian, why don't we shift to Saskatchewan? I know you're busy as well on the farm in between Regina and Saskatoon there in Saskatchewan.
Yeah, our farm is similar to Fred's. We're a mixture of, we run a cow-calf operation with beef cattle, as well as grains, oilseeds, pulse crops. We're moving fences this morning, trying to rotate some cattle around. In terms of background, I've been my most recent work in the wider farm community is with a group called Farmers for Climate Solutions. I chaired a national task force with them 3 years ago, which resulted in the On-Farm Climate Action Fund money being available to producers across Canada. And then 2 years ago, I chaired a task force with them on business risk management and the relationship between business risk management and sustainability policy. My background, in addition to a farmer, I'm an agricultural economist by training. So have throughout my career been active in a number of the ag policy debates, although I've tried to stay out of a lot of them recently and focus a bit more on the farm. We're a multi-generation farm and both sons are involved here as well. And their families, their partners.
Yeah, certainly bringing a lot of expertise, I'd say, to this conversation. So thank you as well, Ian. And Lindsay, I know is a familiar face to our audience, but maybe Lindsay, fill us in on the parts of your business that are not as familiar to the Real Agriculture audience.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Kelvin. Yeah, so today very much wearing my farmer hat. So our farm is actually within Ottawa city limits. If anybody has seen the map, it is a very big city as far as the lines go. So yes, we are rural, but we are in Ottawa city limits. We run a sheep operation that does agrivoltaics, which is a new term for a lot of people. Essentially, we use our sheep to do vegetation abatement at commercial scale solar sites. So we currently manage about 600 acres under panels using 4 different flocks of sheep. And I also sit on the Ontario Soil Network board. So for this conversation, you're going to hear the farmer side and the soil side of things versus the Real Agriculture hat I wear more often.
Mm-hmm. So the premise of this whole conversation, the main thing we want to talk about is what drives farmers to implement sustainability or environmental practices. And I think maybe it would also, I guess, is to continue on the theme of introductions here. Fred, do you have an example of sustainability or an environmental practice that you would say you have implemented intentionally on your farm or in one of the aspects of your farm in Alberta, Fred?
Dabbled in a few, Calvin. I guess the big one for us would be verified beef production plus or CRSB, Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. So we are a verified operation, and we have been for several years. So that's probably the main one, and dabbled in various kind of ad hoc environmental initiatives in the past, and a lot that aren't. I think we make a lot of decisions on farm that are good for the environment, good for sustaining. And the maximum that you hear farmers say all the time is, I want to leave it in a better condition than what I received it. So, yeah, but that would be the main, CRSB would be the main, I guess, official one. Yeah.
That's a good example. And I like that definition of sustainability too, because that's another thing that I find is coming up in all of these conversations is how do you actually measure sustainability? There's been a huge focus, you could say, from government the last number of years on CO2 equivalent emissions, carbon emissions, but biodiversity, water quality, there's many financial sustainability is also part of that. And like you said, Fred, being able to pass it on to the next generation in better shape kind of thing, it is kind of all encompassing. Ian, what do you see on your farm in terms of your background? I know when we talk about agriculture and farming in Saskatchewan, the massive shift to zero till is often referred to as a practice that's been implemented that has fostered sustainability. What do you see in terms of your perspective and things that you have experience working with?
Yeah, thanks, Kelvin. Well, certainly, the zero till thing is obviously been widespread, and certainly we discontinued tillage many decades ago. But I would say the main changes that we've tried to implement that make a difference, and really in order to improve sustainability, it has to be a new change. We can't sort of continue to harbor on what we've done for the last number of decades. So we implemented variable rate across the grain acres with the SWOT mapping, and we interviewed all the companies that provide variable rate prescriptions to determine their best science on nitrous oxide management. And based on that, we elected to go with SWOT maps to manage our nitrogen applications. And I would say we've cut our nitrogen applications materially as a result of that decision. We're on extremely variable land, and we had quite a few acres that certainly weren't appropriate to be putting nitrogen down. In the last year, we've also moved to a different drill, a disc drill that allows us, well, it's actually a combination pillar lay drill that allows us to get our nitrogen placed exactly where it needs to be. It's interesting, we're extremely dry here, so the nitrous oxide risk, I would say, is less probably of a piece. And one of the real challenges with ag policy is that the prairies are very diverse and Canada is very diverse, so being prescriptive is probably not going to work very well. So we have gone there. But I think the biggest change we've made from the literature I've read is what we haven't done. And what we haven't done is plow down wetlands. Preserved acres, sustainable acres are really important. And with a mixed operation, we can make some use of that bush. But we've also just made an intentional decision. So if you go across this farm, when you add up the acres, there's about 300 acres which show up on the StatsCan piece as wasteland, but it's really wetlands and trees and other things that we've made a decision not to destroy as we built this operation. And I think that's the piece that we have to talk a bit more about, because that's what's, in some ways people can improve their outcomes by what they don't do. I think, with the off-cap and actually some of the private money through NCC and others, we've improved our intensity of our grazing operation too, which has allowed us to graze grasslands by species and timing the time of the year when the different species in some of those broader range pastures should be grazed. And that's both good for the soil and good for the biodiversity.
All right. I think we're gonna get back to a bunch of those different aspects there shortly here, Ian. But Lindsay, why don't you talk a bit about what you mentioned, this idea of grazing solar sites. To me, it seems like there's a lot of different angles to sustainability when it comes to the win-win-win. Is it a triple win on
win?
Agrivoltaics?
Yeah, agrivoltaics. So yeah, and we have to unpack maybe a few things here. We do several different things when we're grazing solar. So first, I want to state we are grazing existing sites. So these are not brand new. These aren't being put in. These are existing sites that need to deal with the vegetation that's below those panels. And yes, lots grows underneath solar panels. It's a big myth that somehow these, create this desert or scorched earth underneath. They don't. We have an incredible amount of growth that happens under these panels. And for us, because we manage the grazing, so we're doing a service. We are providing basically mowing services with our sheep, but we do manage the grazing. We cross-fence extensively. We move our flock every 1 to 2 days so that they are non-selective in what they have to eat, so that they're going to eat the non-desirable and the desirable species that they like. And they are trying to keep those panels clear, trying to keep things like grapevines and Manitoba maples and all those sorts of things from poking through and breaking those panels. But it accomplishes a few things. And I think about the one site that we're on near here, what we call our home site, near Armprior, and it's a 200-acre site. It is surrounded by corn and beans. And our site, because we manage that grazing, because that flock is moving, that site, once we have plants that are up and flowering, there's always flowering plants on that site. So for native pollinators, there's a huge milkweed population for the monarchs that come through. For ground nesting birds, there's always space on that 200 acres for that biodiversity, for that habitat that really doesn't exist in abundance around there. I'm not saying there's none, but I'm saying it's not abundant. And so the solar site actually has become very much a cornerstone of the habitat for the area. We have bobolinks, we've got all sorts of spiders that get wrapped in your helmet and while you're trying to fence in it, but I respect their work, so I smile and keep going. And so it's, we also are testing the soil to ensure that, or to have some numbers to back up what we are quite certain we are doing as far as capturing carbon and building the soil organic matter on these sites. So, that's off-site. But what it also has allowed us to do is our home farm of 100 acres. We have some sensitive areas. We have a creek that sort of dissects our farm. We've got some riparian areas. We've got places that, we want permanent cover. And it's allowed us to essentially turn our whole home acres into permanent cover. For the most part, it's taking a few years of converting everything over. We use a lot of annual forage, that sort of stuff. But it's allowed us to set up perennial cover at home as well, because we don't need those acres necessarily, or to push them as hard, because the sheep are off-site during the year. So, and I'm glad the gentlemen have also mentioned the economic part of it. This is a big part of, doing the right thing, quote unquote, is you still have to be able to farm and be able to farm for the next generation and the one after that. It can't just be that this is a feel-good thing or it's the right thing to do for the environment. There has to be a way to still sustain the business. And so for us, solar grazing also plays into that, in that it is an income stream. We are paid to graze these sites because we provide that service. So that is in addition to, the managed grazing and the habitat and the biodiversity. There has to be a payment for that.
And there's also diesel fuel isn't being burned to mow those sites either, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We have almost eliminated any mowing, not 100%. We've made hay in the site, so of course we do need to put up winter feed. We can't avoid that, although we also do cover crop grazing, and we extend our grazing as long as we can, sometimes into January, to decrease the amount of winter feed we have to put up. But it offsets any of the mowing that would have to happen. And for the most part, we've eliminated herbicide use on site, but we still reserve the right to do so, and actually are right now working on a pilot project to try and get a hold of burdock in the site. It is really bad and it wrecks the wool. So we are using herbicides to do that, but we can be really selective about that. And that, I think, is a win.
Going back to you, Ian, talking about wetlands and the decision that you've made on your farm to not interfere with wetlands. Can you shed some light on why you have made that decision? Because I think that gets to the heart of this discussion we want to have here. Often there has to be an economic reason for making a decision. Is there a certain cost or a dollar value that you've attached to maintaining those wetlands, and is it just that it's low enough that you put up with having them and farming around them?
I think that's the bottom line, Kelvin. Yeah, no, and that's been a multi-generation piece. I mean, this farm was started by my father's grandparents, and I remember after my dad got hurt, working with my grandfather, and basically him beating in my head that trees were essential for the environment. And so, we've farmed around the trees, and you can really tell when you drive around our farm, the land that we is part of the original sort of 2 sections or so versus all the different land sites we bought, because the lands we bought have many less trees on them as a result of that. And yeah, there is a cost. There's no question. If I spray a half section that's got a multiple number of trees on it, I have to allow for a certain amount more product than I do in that, because the overlap actually exceeds the amount of wetland coverage that there would have been. But there's also a tremendous benefit. And there's been a lot of years when the combination of wind protection, and in this year we've had 10 inches of rain since the 1st of May, and all of those lands on other people that they chose to plow down are now flooded, and they're a salinity risk, where we will have no salinity issues because those trees percolate the landscape, and all of those water sites are back in the areas that we left behind. So in a normal cycle rotation, a lot of those acres you would have gone around anyway. It's true that if you get rid of the trees, you don't have a tree falling out that you have to get off and move when you're combining. But it's beyond that. It's the cost is, I would say, it probably is measurable. We haven't actually done an exact calculation by quarter as to what that costs us, but it certainly has a number of offsetting benefits. And I know I have a friend who he did tree rows every 400 yards on his farm, and he's been growing through this drought more crop than any of his surrounding neighbors as a result of keeping those trees. So, we haven't done the exact calculations, but there's offsets there, and I don't know what the net cost would be.
Do you think that information would be helpful in terms of potentially moving towards having more farmers make the same decision that you have, Ian? If we knew more about the cost benefit of some of these riparian areas and that type of thing?
I think information always helps. Information's a good thing. I've been a fan of some sort of reverse auction. I got a lot of friends that are sort of into their 70s and 80s and want to sell their land, but they won't do it because they're afraid the new buyer will plow the bush, and they would put a permanent easement on that for very low cost to the public if that type of program was readily available. So I think there needs to be some public money, and I think there needs to be better information to make those things happen.
Okay. Fred, you talked about the verified beef program and participating in VB Plus. Is that a monetary decision, or are there other reasons for participating in that? Is it driven by the premium, or are there other, I guess I'm asking if there are non-monetary incentives for participating in that from your perspective as well?
It depends on the day you ask me, Calvin.
Yeah. Is it the audit day or not? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. As Ian said and Lindsay said, that there's a whole bunch of factors that come into it when we're making these types of decisions, and cost benefit is a huge one. But like Ian said, some of those decisions are more subjective, and the information on making them more objective would be great. But I think for us with verified beef production, it did help us to enroll, to know that there was the possibility of some economic return. And our farm has benefited from that. I don't know whether, sometimes I really question on whether, that financial reward is really fair, I guess, or if it's going down the value chain in an equitable proportion. I tell this story sometimes, and it really discouraged me. Being invited to a reception by a major agri-food food service company, being told as a producer how important it was to be sustainable and to be CRSP certified, but then going to sell market ready cattle produce the next week and being told by their supplier that, well, that's not a consideration. That's so discouraging, to be told it's important, what you're doing is important, but the information doesn't flow back up the value chain or down the value chain. So mixed messages are such a problem, I think, for us in ag. It's probably true in all industries, but mixed messages are such a problem with some of these initiatives.
Do you see any ways of resolving that miscommunication or that disconnect between value recognition at one stage and not at the other stage, that type of thing? Or it does sometimes, I know from a farmer's perspective, also sometimes seems like that's the cost of doing business these days, is meeting that ever increasing bar. Is that how you see it, Fred?
Yeah.
Or do you see examples of programs or maybe value chains where that value does that incentive actually is noticed at the farm level?
Well, there's some small examples, I think, and off the top of my head, I can't list them right now, but there are instances where it does work up and down the value chain, and that communication flows, and the finances flow too. So it's possible. I just, in our society, we see so many of these, so many mixed messages that seem inconsistent. And it's frustrating. I think there's ways of being better communicators, but yeah, just in our humanity, we're not perfect about it. So yeah,
yeah. Ian, do you have any perspectives? You're also in many ways a commodity producer. I think maybe Lindsay can maybe speak to this yet too, about direct marketing off farm might have more opportunity sometimes for having that incentive passed directly from the buyer to the farm level, the farm gate level. But Ian, you're also in the business of producing commodities. How do you feel about having the market created
that's like
for them?
Like Fred, we went into verified meat program early. In our case, there was a bit of a tie to some of the provincial programs. So in terms of getting matched dollars on some of the stuff, there was an incentive recognizing that it wasn't going to come through the product price initially. And you hit on it, Kelvin, when you said we're in the business of producing commodities, and we've built a marketing infrastructure with really 2 major kill plants in Western Canada for the beef that have to go through, and 4 or 5 grain companies that pick up most of the products. And their capacity to discern and identify products that are done somewhat differently in different parts of the world or in different parts of the prairies is virtually zero. And in part because we haven't agreed on a good set of metrics. We don't know what is the mechanisms to measure whether A is better than B is better than C. And the Holos model and stuff is very inadequate, I think, in many ways to describe the sustainability efforts that are there. And in part, it falls back on farm leadership. I hats off to the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef in that they made an effort to have a discussion. That discussion hasn't even happened in grains and oilseeds in a way that is really very meaningful. And it's in part because there seems to be a willingness to just say no rather than recognize that we're facing Scope 3 emissions measurement in a little over a year, and farmers haven't been at the table on the grain side at all to start to work on those measures. And what works on my farm is going to be way different than what works in Northeast Saskatchewan or what works on Fred's farm in Southwest Alberta, just because precipitation, heat units, and all things determine a lot of the relative value of doing different approaches. Just the relative variability of the landscape matters in terms of what the right first step is to improve your outcomes. And we just haven't got measures that are sensitive enough to capture what farmers are trying to do. And at an ag grad reunion, a friend of mine said, Ian, it's really just about being good at what you do. And to the extent that we can figure out how to align the financial results with being good at what we do, it depends on a good set of metrics for sustainability, and those don't exist, particularly for grains and oilseeds.
But Ian, do you see, you mentioned Scope 3 emissions, and we have, of course, heard over the last number of years more and more companies talking about that, and we're seeing sustainability reporting requirements being brought forward as well. Do you see, are we on a collision course there in terms of the market demand meeting the farm level and farm level not having the right practices in place? Or is this a case of things changing too far too quickly and it'll just get kicked down the road? Or how do you see it unfolding in terms of the implementation of some of these requirements or expectations from end users and people further down the value chain?
Well, I think, Kelvin, I would have put an and instead of an or between those two thoughts. I think there'll be some of both. I suspect there's going to be a collision course, and I think there's going to be a bunch of stuff gets kicked down the road because of the lack of an ability to measure and verify and separate and essentially, essentially put a label on different products that have a measure that is essentially meeting the customer's expectation down the value chain, simultaneous to being reasonable in terms of how it's developed at the farm gate. And the farm groups haven't spent enough time in that to make anything that's on the table seem reasonable. My big fear is that there'll be 17 different ones. And in order to have a competitive market as a farmer, I'll have to figure out how to meet all of them. And that's potentially a really undesirable outcome. And so I think we are headed towards a collision course. I think a lot of what's on the table right now is silly, might be too strong, but it's just not going to fit together. And we need to figure out how to move relatively quickly to get some metrics that make sense.
Lindsay, do you have thoughts on how the market could drive change on farms? I guess in your case, where you're selling mostly direct off farm, right? Farmers markets, yep. And you have a direct connection and feedback loop there with your end user. I guess that's maybe a slightly different example than commodities, where we're starting to see companies demanding Scope 3 emissions reporting requirements and things like that.
Yeah, so it's a different, and it depends on the year how much we sell direct, but we do work with direct customers, restaurants, direct to butchers, direct to abattoirs, where we are maybe perhaps a little more, it's a shorter value chain perhaps to the final consumer. And so that does allow for communication, for one-on-one discussions, those sorts of things that you can sort of open up the door and have very frank discussions about, the operation of that I run. But I hear, in this conversation, and it's a challenge that bleeds through to, I think, everything that we produce realistically, is there's a few things we've hit on. One is that, new demands become, quote unquote, the cost of doing business, which essentially means that erodes the profit margin. Guess what? That's what farmers get to do. We get to take on more reporting or more measuring or more, meet new requirements, whatever the case may be. And that's time and effort, possibly software, et cetera, that just comes out of our pocket. The other thing that I find interesting is that, in talking about measurements, and we're bang on, like I am one that feels like you're right. We have to show that we are doing what we're doing. I get it. But in the absence of, an actual sort of quick to implement, easy to deal with, what's specific to a farm, we deal with modeling. This is where we have sort of gone as sort of proxy to doing on-farm measuring and on-farm requirements. And so I get a little frustrated because I think we all want similar things. And I say farmers, industry, value chain, et cetera, but we don't necessarily want to be absolutely overrun with paperwork and new requirements that we have to meet and 6 different standards, et cetera. But we also don't necessarily want to be handed a model that has no application to where we are. I mean, where I farm versus where Fred and Ian farm, completely different as far as rainfall, as far as soil type, as far as length of season, et cetera. So we are stuck in this sort of like dueling sort of things where we don't have a clear answer of how we can prove that we are doing what we say we're doing, that isn't also completely onerous. And this is where some sort of, or a mix of support systems, et cetera, I just don't know that we've got a clever enough answer yet that sort of gives us, a clear path forward as to a reporting or recording mechanism. I think I'm more keen on recording versus having to report. but we also, as farmers, have to recognize we probably are going to have to change a couple things that we do. And when I say change, I mean maybe not our practices, I mean how we record things. So what do we keep track of? How long do we keep those records, etc.? And as a livestock producer, I will tell you flat out, people don't like that very much, because it adds costs and it adds time and it adds all of those things. And so somewhere we have to find that balance of, farmers want to be respected, farmers want to be recognized for the work that they're doing, and as Ian puts it, new things that we're doing, not just resting on the past 30 or 40 years, but looking forward of what we're changing and what we're adding and what we're doing differently. If we're supposed to be respected for that, which I would agree with Fred that that communication doesn't always go up or down the value chain depending on which way we think we are, that realistically we have to be able to prove what we're doing and the why. And I do think that, we have examples of programs like what Fred's involved in, and what Ian's been involved with. I've received off-calf funding for some fencing, and, we have these bits and pieces, etc. But I think we are missing some sort of larger recognition, that for what farmers can do. And if I may, there's one point that I know, Kelvin, we have talked about sort of behind the scenes at Real Agriculture, but because I'm wearing my farmer hat, I want to make it here. I was at a meeting this past winter where there were dairy farmers, sheep producers, grain farmers, all over from this area. And the dairy farmer, and we were talking about sustainability, and we were talking about carbon capture and, emissions and carbon credits and all those things. And the mood in the room was farmers want to participate. They wanted to be part of this. They wanted to show what they were doing. They wanted to reach net zero if they could. And the one particular farmer was like, I want to know, is my farm net zero? Like, what can I do that? And basically was told, but you don't need to. We have models for that. Don't worry about it. So there's we're missing this part of okay, so on one hand, people who are farmers who are making changes and doing things and want to maybe do these actual measurements, etc., are sort of being pushed off and saying, no, that's too onerous. And so we're sort of missing out on, I think, and maybe it's not the biggest group of people, but there's definitely farmers who are like, no, I want to be part of this. And there isn't a clear path to do that. And I think we're missing out on that too. I think that we could really actually get somewhere if we started to put some real faces and names together and some numbers and actually work through some of these math problems. I'll be quiet.
I think that's something that's actually supported by some of the data that Cappy and RealAgristudies found in some of the farmer survey work done last year. Farmers are willing to implement these practices and wanting to implement them. It's just a matter of how that signal is sent, and often it has to do with being outcome based, not necessarily practice based. And I think that leads to maybe another part of this discussion that we need to have as we're quickly running out of time. But the role of government, a lot of what we've talked about here is the private market, how those signals are being communicated. Fred, what's your opinion on the role of government in driving some of these practices at the farm level? Is it in the supporting development of models and data collection and methods that Ian and Lindsay have talked about? Is it on the research side of things? I know that's something that you are heavily involved in terms of researching new practices, and often that leads to adoption because of farmers then seeing how things work, and the whole living labs concept that the federal government has rolled out is based on that premise. Or is it on actual payments to farmers like the off-calf program has had, where it's based around certain programs? That would be another example of government involvement. What do you see as kind of the role of federal and provincial, I guess, politicians and government bureaucracies in driving this at the farm level?
I think a combination of all those things, Calvin, but for me, a big one is the research. And let's, in terms of getting a representative metrics for many of our farms and many of the locations across Canada. We've been talking about that for the last few minutes. What's the societal cost of garbage in, garbage out? To me, that's scary. And the whole Scope 3 discussion, and Ian touched on it, we just don't have that. We don't have the metrics for it right now. And are we going to end up in a wreck as a result? So for me, the federal government, provincial government, research is the biggest thing. Policy that I don't want to be dealing with 17 different organizations like Ian was talking about to determine, okay, does our farm qualify for this program and maybe these small payments? I want something that is representative and real, practical, and not, like Lindsay was saying, not hard to implement. Like, we're already overwhelmed. I can't believe how much time I spend keeping information that I didn't have to do 10, 20 years ago. And it's not all bad. It's, some of it's good, but it really cuts into productivity, like, if it becomes too onerous. So yeah, I look to our governments to good policy so that we don't have to sort through dozens and dozens of different private initiatives to figure it out.
Yeah. Ian, what's your perspective on how government should be involved? I know we're also facing the prospect of political change and tightening purse strings and that type of thing as well. What do you see as the priorities or things that should be priorities for government in this area?
Yeah, I'll start by what they shouldn't do, and then we'll move to what I think they could do. Here in Canada is to have policy that is excessively prescriptive, because there's so much variability at the farm level that prescriptive policy tends not to work. Then if I move, and I think it is the case that being a positive force in the development of measures will be good. But if they're a positive force in the development of measures without persuading the farm groups to come to the table and provide the input and be at the table on the necessary measures, it's likely to fail. Because the farm groups have to get out of having their head in the sand on this and start to talk about it. And I just want to leave people with a thought about measures, because different people think about measures differently. There are measures that you can use for improvement. So measures that allow you to get better on your own operation. There are measures that allow you to be accountable to third parties, that you say, okay, and those end up have to be aggregated amongst, like Fred and I and our beef side would probably have to aggregate those in some way so that we could report how we're doing as a Canadian industry, right? To be accountable. And then there's measures that are useful for research. And I, like Fred, am a huge fan of research. I think it is going to be central to us getting from where we are to where we need to be. But the way researchers need to measure is different than the way we need to measure for accountability or for improvement. Because researchers need to essentially have a control, and they need to test for one outcome, and they need to know whether or not a specific thing. And I think it's useful to know that what's missing, I think, are the measures to allow us to, in our own operation, measure things that matter so we know whether or not we're individually getting better, and measures for accountability, which are things that Fred and I can add up to talk about the beef calves that we put on the marketplace or other things that allow us to distinguish ourselves from other players in the market.
Okay. So, Ian, do you see off-calf as having been an experiment then in terms of paying producers to implement certain practices, or is it something that you think government should maintain as a priority?
Okay, so as the chair of the group that sold that to government, I said what we needed to do was change the discussion. So in other words, put some money out there that started some discussions about what could be done and done differently. It was more prescriptive than I would have liked as a policy framework, but I think it dramatically changed the discussion. As a model, I think off-calf was appropriate, and I think it has potential with specific policies that are shown to be fairly easily applied across a wide section of agriculture. I think that the number of policies that will work for is quite limited, and that we need to move to the next level. Fred mentioned information transfer. That's a good role for government. That's a good extension. Having a single source of solid information is a good role. The other one that's a good role is working to bring people together to get good common ways to measure outcomes and to collect outcomes and to talk about outcomes. And I think in many ways, in Canadian ag policy, we've been good at solving yesterday's problems, and we're usually working at the things we fought about 10 years ago and figure out how to but we need to solve tomorrow's problems. And I think tomorrow's problems are about meeting the challenge that the marketplace is going to give us on sustainability and being able to respond with real metrics. And we're going to need some leadership from government to do that.
All right. Final thoughts, Lindsay, on government involvement in this?
So I think that's a really good summary of where we see government's role. And I think it's important that we define that and that we have that conversation, because I think that we certainly, as an industry, are often, asking for one thing and wanting another thing, and we don't speak with a united voice at all across commodities, even though some of us might grow many. Sometimes there's, opposing views on things or on what the wants and needs are of, our export dependent markets versus our domestic markets, all of those things. So I think it is important that we outline where, as Canadians, where we see value for our government and where that role might land. And hopefully have the policies that come from that. I wanted to, on the OFCAF point specifically on changing the discussion, I would agree that I think it's been an interesting funding model and focused on those three things, on cover crops, on rotational grazing, and on nitrogen management. By focusing on three things, it did certainly and has, and I would think continue to sort of keep us focused on three things. Was it perfect? No. But at the same time, it certainly did change the conversation by focusing it, I think. On the point of, the role of government, extension, yes, please. We are hurting on the extension side for just about every commodity, I think. Maybe not all, but we also have a pretty fragmented, every province sort of handles it their own way. And that is just how we seem to do things in agriculture and probably how we'll continue to do, but that also makes it potentially challenging to meet that extension demand for sure.
Yeah. Well, this is a topic that I think we've just touched the surface on in terms of different angles and aspects of this discussion, but I know that all three of you are extremely busy, so I want to say thank you again to Fred, Ian, and Lindsay for joining us here on the Ag Policy Connection to discuss this important topic of implementing sustainability practices at the farm level. Thank you, all three of you.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah, a topic that we could talk about for much longer, only scratching the surface there in terms of different angles to discuss about ultimately what drives the adoption of sustainable practices that are deemed to be better for the environment and better for the sustainability ultimately of farms and ranches across our country. Again, thanks to Ian McCreary, Fred Lozman, and Lindsay Smith for joining us here on this episode of the Ag Policy Connection. We are, just a programming note, we are nearing the end of this season of the Ag Policy Connection, which again has been brought to you by CAPI and Real Agriculture. And so for our final episode for this season, we are going to invite back Tyler McCann, the Managing Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. And we're going to have a discussion about what we learned on this season. We're going to recap each episode, kind of go through the takeaways and some of the common themes that we heard when it comes to the future of Canadian agriculture, the direction that we need to be moving in terms of policy development and how sustainability fits, how it works through that sustainability lens that is increasingly a priority, not only for governments, but for many other players in our markets as well. So with that, on behalf of Real Agriculture, the production team, and the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, thanks for joining us here on the Ag Policy Connection once again, and we'll be back with another episode here in the coming days.